This is ContraZoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota Arsenault. This is the first episode of our 10th season, which is absolutely crazy to me. If you are new to the show, welcome. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. I'll do some minor housekeeping here before we dive into the episode. We're not just a podcast, but we publish movie reviews too, if you did not know that. ContraZoomPod.com is constantly publishing new reviews, and right now we're doing a focus on covering films nominated at this year's Canadian Screen Awards. We already have reviews published for Blackberry, Red Rooms, Hey Victor, Fitting In, Seagrass, Humanist Vampire Seeking Consenting Suicidal Person, Before the Sun, Polaris, with more coming. And make sure you follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, and TikTok, all under @ContraZoomPod. And as I say at the end of each show, if you really like us, consider tipping us on coffee, which you can find the link to in the show notes of every episode and on our socials. And it just sort of helps us help pay the maintenance fees and things like that we need to run this show. But on to today's show. We are continuing our A24 Retrospective series. This is our 27th edition of the show. You can listen to recent episodes like 265, A24 Retrospective Amy, 262, A24 Retrospective Barely Lethal, or go all the way back to 108, A History of A24 Films, to get the full backstory of the company. Today we are looking at the 2015 film The End of the Tour, directed by James Ponsoldt. The film is based on the memoir, Although Of Course You End Up Becoming Yourself, by David Lipsky. It details the 5 days that Lipsky, a journalist for Rolling Stone, spent interviewing postmodernist writer David Foster Wallace after the surprise success of his 1,000-page tome, Infinite Jest. I want to welcome to the show for the first time Nick Tiffany. Nick is a critic that posts video reviews on YouTube under the NT Movie Reviews channel, and you can see all of his collected work over at nicktiffany.com. He's also one of the newest members of the Cascadia Film and Television Critics Association. So welcome to the show, Nick. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much, Dakota. I'm doing great, thank you.
Excellent. So I'm very excited to have you. This is not only your first time on the A24 Retrospective, which I do like to have some returning people, but this is your first time on the show, so I really appreciate you taking the time today to join us.
No, well, thank you. I appreciate you taking the gamble, having me on here for the 10th season. Number one, first off the bat, congratulations. That's really awesome, and I'm not going to succumb to the pressure of this first episode.
It's pretty wild to me. It's only this is now the 9th anniversary, but it's the 10th season. I don't know quite how the math is mathing for that, but I think it's because
that's incredible.
2 years per season, sort of thing. But yeah,
cool.
I can't believe it.
That's amazing. I'm super stoked to be here. You got me at a good time as well. I think the A24 Retrospective, coming as it's doing almost 10 or so years into their history, I think it's great. There's so many terrific films that they have, so many different styles of films that they expose audiences to, much like the one we're talking about today.
Yeah.
And so I think shining a light on them is just super awesome.
Well, I'm glad you agree, and I think that's a great segue, because as a first-time guest, before we get into this movie, I want to ask you the A24 4 questions that I always ask the new guests on this series. So we're going to start out with question number 1. Super basic. Going to start off really easy. Going to throw you a softball right down the middle. What are your top 3 A24 films?
All righty. Top 3 A24 films. This doesn't feel like a softball, but we will hit this out of the park. If I had to have a definitive number 1 A24 film, I think it's got to be Ex Machina, both for, I think it's replay value, everything I've been able to get from it after each watch. I think just the writing, the direction, the look of it, and everything. The first time I saw it, when I was down at South by Southwest, it just totally blew me away. Totally, like a lot of their films maybe do, reframes what I might imagine science fiction could look like. It doesn't have to just be everything flashy. There's so much intelligence behind it. It is, really revealing about humanity as well in a lot of different ways. And so Ex Machina, I could show it to anybody. Totally blows their mind, totally feels different in so many ways from what they have seen before. So definitely the number one. I think number two, throwing it back a little bit as well for A24, would probably be The Witch. And I thought long and hard about this because there are a lot of really great horror films and thriller films, I would say, under the A24 banner. But going back to Robert Eggers' the first time I had seen that film, I think I was at home under the recommendation of a couple other critics. And I watched it with a buddy of mine. And we were so genuinely freaked out and just spooked by the dedication to the period, the craft, the ambiance. I mean, the score is just kind of haunting. You got Black Phillip, so many unsettling things in that movie, which very early on kind of showed me the potential too of A24 and what you might be getting into when you choose to watch one of their films. And so that dedication to the period, something that Eggers has obviously kind of carried with him, has just stuck with me, especially the ending of that film too. And then I'd probably say my number three would probably be A Most Violent Year by J.C. Chandor. Oscar Isaac and Jessica Chastain are more than just a great Juilliard pairing of actors. And just, that was another one too, where I didn't expect going into it to enjoy it as much as I did, for being a slow burn, mafia-esque kind of thriller, kind of a study of immigrant America, trying to hold on to your morality as the world around you is kind of shifting. I totally dug it. I think Oscar Isaac and Jessica Chastain are probably two of my favorite and just two of the most talented actors out there. And watching that film again, I went back, I kind of listened to a good bit of your retrospective on that, just as I was figuring my favorite A24 films. And they just, that's such a unique feeling movie, especially these days. And it's just shot beautifully by Bradford Young. And, I think that hit me probably at a time too, where I was just getting ready. Maybe I was just starting college, I think, at the time, but maybe taking film a little bit more seriously, or trying to, as I'm leaving high school and whatnot. But no, that one has always stuck with me, and rewatching it, maybe I think last year, really just kind of confirmed again how much I liked it, and how incredible the cast and crew is across the board.
So first off, I gotta say that is a terrific top three. Like you really knocked it out of the park there with naming those three movies. It really speaks to my sort of sensibilities of what I really appreciate from A24. I'll quickly touch on all three of them. So first with Ex Machina, you said you saw it at South by Southwest. Does that mean you saw it like in the first time it was being screened? Maybe not the premiere, but like its initial premiere.
So I can't, for the life of me, I can't remember what I saw the opening night, because it played opening night. I think I had ran off to somewhere else just because I was like, well, I don't think there's any chance I'm getting in. It's my first festival. I'm just going to try to do what I can without missing out on too much of the big stuff. But I ended up being able to tack on an extra day at the end of the trip, because a buddy of mine was going to be going back to Houston the next day. So I was like, okay, cool. I could go check out Ex Machina because it played the closing of the festival as well. And Alex Garland was there for that. Kind of did a little intro for the film. Was just incredible. And it was kind of cool because at the same time in Seattle, where I'm from and where I'm at now again, they were going to be doing interviews with Alex Garland over the phone. And it was one of those deals where I'm still, having just moved a few months ago, I'm still on some of the press list for Seattle. And so I'm getting the emails and I'm like, well, hey, I've already seen this film. Is there any way I could do a phoner? Like, you wouldn't have to worry about setting up a screening or anything for me. And so they were able to set up like a 15-minute call with Alex Garland. And so I was able to watch it one more time. I think maybe the week leading up to it. But man, those first couple weeks, because I like South by Southwest does, or some of the film festivals, there's always a good number of films that might release within the month following. Mm-hmm. And it usually is one of the bigger pictures, I feel like. But no, that was one where as soon as I saw that, it was like, okay, well, I'm writing 1 billion words on this and I can't wait to talk to people about this, because it was just such a different approach to especially AI and what sentience could be and all these different things. And it was just so intellectually engaging that I was just dying to talk to somebody about it after watching it.
Yeah, I can't imagine what those crowds were like seeing it at South by for like the first times it was being screened, because it's such a unique and interesting movie where it's playing with so many different genres, and then you got that powerhouse trio of performances from all of them, really. And it's scary, it's funny, it's got like, it's ruminating on a whole bunch of different ideas of what is going on right at that moment when it came out, and also dealing with what might be the future. So it's so interesting, and I can't imagine what that crowd was like, probably just on the edge of their seats the whole time.
Well, and I think Alex Garland really does such a good job with unsettling sound design, which if you've seen Civil War, you might echo some of that as well. But Ex Machina, I caught it again when they put it back in IMAX last month. Kind of there's A24 and IMAX. They're doing Hereditary and then Uncut Gems. But watching it again, so much of how he uses sound and these kind of robotic sci-fi sound effects, but they're just turned up to 11. And, you know, it's kind of pulse pounding as something's happening, kind of disorients you a little bit. It's almost like the high-pitched frequency noise. As you're watching something go on, you're like, I'm unsure of what's happening here. It doesn't seem like it's great, but no, the audience ate it up. And especially towards the end, we're pretty shocked with how things kind of end up there. You know, for those who haven't seen it, I won't spoil it, but just a terrific ending, a cold ending, but great.
And then also, you know, The Witch, I feel like is a fairly popular answer. A lot of people really love and appreciate that film, so it's nice seeing that up on your list there. But I like that you really included A Most Violent Year, because I sort of feel like that's, I don't want to call it an underrated pick, because I think a lot of people have seen it, but it's probably, you know, not the first one a lot of people go to when they're talking about A24 specifically. So I really appreciate the shout out there, because I think it's one of their best releases that they've ever done.
It totally fits into a world of its own, just among all the kinds of films that they make. But I'm with you. I think with all who are involved, maybe it's easy to not overlook it, but you're like, oh, okay, of course, it's great performances, you know, solid writing, storytelling, whatnot. But I don't know, you dig a little deeper. I think there's a lot to appreciate just on a cinematic level there, from Chandler's direction, which, you know, he is just a really curious filmmaker to me. From Margin Call to All Is Lost to A Most Violent Year. You know, his projects are very interesting, totally all over the place, but anchored by just incredible performances.
Yeah, I absolutely adore Chandler's first three films. And then the complete opposite, I think his next film, Triple Frontier, was one of the worst movies I've ever seen. And I'm not looking forward to his Kraven the Hunter this year, because that looks pretty awful too. But there is talk about a sequel to A Most Violent Year. I know he's kind of been talking about it for a few years, and Oscar Isaac's been saying, like, hey, if it ever happens, I'd love to revisit these characters. So I really hope, you know, Chandler's able to do a sequel, because I think there's still so much story that you can tell with the characters that Isaac and Chastain play. But and also would be nice to see Chandler return to maybe a bit more grounded reality.
You know, and I'm like looking at it here, and I'm like, I totally forgot that he directed Triple Frontier. I remember when that had come out on Netflix, and I felt like, wow, this is a super solid cast. You know, it's just stacked to the brim with Hollywood's go-to guys. That was pretty enjoyable for a bit, and then when I find out that it was J.C. Chandler, I was like, huh. I didn't totally feel that maybe in some of the narrative necessarily. He's definitely going with the more action-heavy front there, but consequences and selfishness and certain things and maybe consistencies you find across his film that kind of pick back up there. But now I totally forgot he did that one.
Yeah. Let's all forget about that one. Let's move on to the next question. And this is one I'm always sort of curious about. What was your introduction to A24?
A24. So back in, I'd say the end of 2012 was kind of my intro to the world of film criticism, credentialed film critics, things like that. A good family friend had invited me and my dad to an early screening of Django Unchained. He knew I was a big fan of Quentin Tarantino and movies and never shut up about movies. And so he was like, hey, well, it's a birthday present. They're screening it a couple weeks early. Do you want to come? And so went with him to Django, spent an hour probably talking to all these different film critics. They've got a pretty solid core here in Seattle. And after that, I was hooked. I went home. I'm like, I'm going to write a movie review now. I'm going to try some of this. And so, I was bit by the bug and just started to kind of continue to go as this man's guest. His name is Mike Ward. A shout out to him for just getting me embedded and started in all of this. So 2013 is kind of the first year that I'm reviewing on my own, working towards being credentialed, going as a guest with him to what I can, watching things on VOD at home as that platform is kind of blowing up. But Spring Breakers was probably the first inkling of A24 that I ever got. There was a lot of talk surrounding it, kind of leading up to it. Had no idea who Harmony Korine was, but I was like, okay, you got James Franco, Selena Gomez, Vanessa Hudgens. I'm like, this is an interesting cast there. And I forget where I had to go to see it, but it was one of those where I'm like, okay, I'm going to seek this out. I don't think I was able to go to the press screening. But I was just curious. And when I watched it for the first time, it was almost like thinking of them playing piano and singing Britney Spears by the water. There's so many moments in that film where I was like, I've never watched a movie like this before, I don't think. Or from the color to the use of sound to the use of some of the violence in there and the neon lights and everything. I was just like, this is a really unique movie experience that I don't think I've ever had before. And shortly after that, you've got The Bling Ring, Enemy, Under the Skin, Lock, The Spectacular Now. It was just, I feel like I kind of honed in and it was like, okay, well, whatever these guys are doing, I'm curious to see what's coming next. And then it was just like one after the other. It was like, wow, these are just completely unique, fascinating films that I know maybe not everybody's going to dig, but it was like a rabbit hole. It was like, okay, this is kind of like, I'm not saying that this is what cinema is, but it feels like whatever they're doing at A24, they're giving them enough rope to really try some cool things, whether narratively, structurally, just in how the films are directed. And so that first slew of their 2013 films was just incredible. I remember that same year, I think, I'd flown down to Houston, maybe visiting some family, and we're there for a few days. And as I feel like I do when I go somewhere and I'm like, well, hey, I know the movie is coming out this weekend, and even though I'm not home, if we're not doing anything tonight, you want to drop me off at the movie theater, because I'm like, there's a movie called The Rover, and Robert Pattinson from Twilight. This is supposed to be a big turn for him as an actor, doing something serious, So I remember dragging my mom to go see that because she likes Guy Pearce too. And so, really ended up enjoying that. And I was like, that was the start of this belief that like, wow, Robert Pattinson or some of these other actors in these films, Scarlett Johansson and Under the Skin, I was like, these are performances for them that I'm not used to, but I'm really excited that they kind of had the opportunity to do this project. So that set me off. And then from there on, it was like, okay, well, whatever A24 does, I'm there. They start dipping into documentaries with Amy. That might not have been the first one they did, but I think that was the first one that I probably watched. And again, that one that almost made my top 3 films for A24. Just incredible filmmaking. They just pick such terrific projects. So getting on that press list the first year, I always thought it's always cool when the big comic book films kind of come in, and being in high school at the time, I'm sure I was stoked to go see Iron Man 3 and some other stuff. But when those A24 emails hit, it was like, ooh, this is something cool. Like I'm excited for this.
Nice. Yeah, you got on board real quick. So kudos to you. You were on the hype train early. All right. So moving on to question number 3: what director, dead or alive, would make a good A24 film?
I thought about this one a lot, and I went back through a lot of some of my older favorite directors, Whether it's Spielberg or a Scorsese or someone who I've admired for a long time. But I don't know. I got into this as I was reading some of your questions. It's like, okay, who's maybe not done enough films, or who's done few enough films that they could still put an A24 film under their belt before they go on to a different level of pedigree. Because I feel like that is kind of a common trend with A24 or some of their filmmakers. I'm not saying they age out, but your Robert Eggers and some of them are slowly starting to develop films at other companies. But at first I wanted to say Taylor Sheridan, weirdly, because he's, on top of doing all the Yellowstone stuff, Wind River. I remember watching that just on a whim after work one night. No clue of anything about it. Totally captivated me. Totally caught me off guard. Kind of put Taylor Sheridan on my radar. And I want to say him, but I think I'm going to say Tom Ford.
Oh.
And that's because Nocturnal Animals, the only film he's done, that was a movie that just totally gripped me, totally surprised me on a level of like, okay, this guy designs suits and menswear, and he's coming out with a really layered, interesting story, a terrifying scenario, which kind of also, having grown up a little bit of my life in Texas, I've been out on those West Texas roads and hundreds of miles without any light at night. It's pretty unsettling. And I think he worked with such a great cast there to start, from Gyllenhaal to Michael Shannon to Aaron Taylor Johnson, who's just a freaking creep. I feel like I would be really interested to see what Tom Ford would choose to do if they kind of gave him some of that free reign. I know he worked with like a 30-some or 20-some $million budget, I think, for Nocturnal Animals. But I don't know. It's a movie that so many pieces of it have stuck with me, whether just because they were so unsettling and freaky, or just I find myself thinking when I'm out, like, all right, if someone tries honking at me and tells me to pull over, no freaking way, man. I'm not. No, I'm not doing that. But I think that what he could bring from his world of fashion, though, and how he sees the world, I would be curious to see narratively what he could blend with, I think, the styling of films that A24 maybe is known for, or potentially could be for him, from the world that he kind of inhabits already.
Yeah, I think he's a great answer. And Nocturnal Animals was actually his second film. His first film was A Single Man, the Colin Firth, Julianne Moore movie, which I love so much. It's a great film. It's about Colin Firth plays a college professor whose lover had just died. He's a gay man, and so his partner, his lifetime partner, had just died, and this is a period piece, I think, in the 60s or early 70s, and so it's sort of him reeling from the aftermath of that, and then Julianne Moore is his friend, who they kind of are trying to work through his trauma, sort of thing. But it's a beautiful, gorgeous film. The costume design is immaculate, and I was actually a little mixed on Nocturnal Animals. I liked the premise of it, and I thought the way that they cast everyone, of people that look similar to the actors that you actually confuse in your day-to-day life, was a great job of him to do it. And so the fact that he's done this like really intimate period piece drama, lavish period piece drama, mixed with this like kind of creepy, kind of gross, thriller-esque movie that's playing with what is fact and what is fiction, he's clearly can do whatever he wants, and I think fits the A24 milieu in that sense of like both of his movies fit in with their style, and he clearly is doing movies as this is the ultimate hobby side project for someone, where he's like, hey, I'm gonna run Dolce and Gabbana and other high-end fashion brands and make some of the best men's fashion you will ever see in your life, and also every once in a while I'm gonna turn out a banger of a movie.
Right, I'm skipping Fashion Week next year, and I guess I can do you guys a favor and drop some crumbs.
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think A24 would work with him, where I think he would prioritize having less of a budget for having more creative freedom, which, you know, you look at someone like Alex Garland, who, if he wanted to, Civil War clearly could have been made with a bigger studio and he could have had a bigger budget. But I think maybe he would have seen maybe the pushback that it was Eggers who did The Northman and was, you know, sort of disappointed by having to work within the studio system and how he sort of regretted taking the bigger budget because that meant you had to appease more people. And I could see someone like Tom Ford being like, you know what, I'm going to go the Garland route and take my mid-budget and be able to do whatever the hell I want.
Yeah, I mean, I see like a Tom Ford Neon Demon instead of a it was funny when we were talking about Neon Demon maybe in the chat a week or so ago. But, you know, something within that realm of models, of modeling, of high fashion, all this kind of stuff. I'm sure he could do something twisted and great looking with that. And I'm glad that you mentioned A Single Man, because now I've got a new movie to watch because I love Julianne Moore and Colin Firth. So I'm super stoked that you put me onto that.
Yeah, that's a great one. All right, and then lastly, the most philosophical question, which I think works well for today's episode that we're doing. What makes an A24 film for you?
You know, I've got my little moleskin out here. You know, I was having to write out some of my thoughts because it's like, you know, what does make an A24 film? I think that what has always struck me when I see A24, the immediate feeling that I have is, I think I am in for either a unique storytelling experience, perhaps a story that maybe otherwise would not be shared by a larger studio, whether it's more intimate and personal family dramas. It could be, I don't know. I think that taking risks on talent is something that A24 has kind of become synonymous with, both for, I think, you know, the movie that we're talking about today, in the level of talent, maybe the actors you might assemble for a project. I think that they really trust their directors and their collaborators. And so because of that, you end up with a lot of films that do take a lot of risks, whether it's narratively or whether it is the obligatory A24 dance sequence that usually finds its way into some film of theirs. But then I guess I would always expect maybe a little bit more of an art house experience from their films on any level. You know, it's Civil War, as grand a scale as it feels for their $50 million budget and as big a film as it is, there's still so much on an intimate level that the film speaks to that most box office films of its size, or most action or war films of its size, would focus on the action and focus less on the journalism aspect, studying and unraveling what had happened in that particular time. So I think more than anything, they just, I think, really challenge the viewer to enjoy something that is out of the normal of what you would watch probably on streaming or that you would go see in the theater.
Yeah, that's a really good answer, and I feel it sort of highlight what a lot of people really appreciate about the type of movies that they both distribute and produce.
Definitely.
Cool. All right. Well, then let's get into this episode now. I'm going to give a little bit of details here.
When I think of this trip, I see David and me in the front seat of his car. He wants something better than he has. I want precisely what he has already.
David Wallace, welcome to Minneapolis.
Hi, I'm David Lipsky.
Oh,
how are you?
Hi. Okay, David and David.
We only just met. He's writing a piece on the tour. What's this story about in your mind?
Just what it's like to be the most talked about writer in the country, that sort of thing.
You're like a nervous guy, huh?
No, I'm okay. How are you?
Because I'm terrified.
I gotta ask, what is with the bandana?
I know that it's a security blanket for me whenever I'm kind of afraid my head is going to explode. If we ate like this all the time, what would be wrong with that?
It's like good, seductive commercial entertainment, like Die Hard.
First Die Hard?
The first Die Hard.
Great
yes.
film.
No, it's a brilliant film.
The best.
The end of the tour was made by director James Ponsoldt, who was the very first director to have 2 films distributed by A24. His 2013 film, The Spectacular Now, which was covered way back on episode 176, where Brody Cottenham joined Rachel and I. Since then, he has made the Tom Hanks tech mystery The Circle and done a lot of work in TV. The film stars Jesse Eisenberg as David Lipsky, a writer who takes a job at Rolling Stone in order to make ends meet. When book publications declare that the race for Best Book in 1996 is all but locked up by upstart novelist David Foster Wallace, played by Jason Segal, Lipsky pitches the idea of doing a profile on the writer who, despite his sudden fame, still teaches creative writing at a small-time college at Illinois State University. The film follows the 5 days the duo spent together as Wallace is completing the last few days of his book tour. Lipsky arrives at Wallace's home in rural Illinois and gets to watch him teach before they head out to Minneapolis, where Wallace has to go to a book signing and do promotional work. In Minnesota, Wallace meets up with 2 female friends of his, an ex-girlfriend, Betsy, played by Mickey Sumner, and a critic-turned-friend, Julie, played by Mamie Gummer. The interviews showcase Wallace's desire to be perceived as an everyman, his intellectual superiority, his addictive personality, and showing hints of his depression, an illness that would eventually cause him to take his own life in 2008 at the age of 46. The film has distribution rights purchased by A24 the day before it was to premiere at the Sundance Film Festival on January 24, 2015. The film had a limited release starting in July 31st. Despite rumblings of potential Oscar nominations, it fell short, but the film still garnered 2 Independent Spirit Award nominations, one for Best Screenplay and one for Best Male Performance for Jason Segal's turn as David Foster Wallace. This is going to be a spoiler-filled episode, so if you've not watched the film, we suggest doing so first. I think the place to start out with is, when I put out feelers to find a guest for this episode, you jumped at the chance immediately, saying you actually interviewed Jason Segal at the time. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about why this movie is one that you're so fond of.
Sure. No, absolutely. I think I had seen it first at the Seattle International Film Festival, which is kind of how the whole Jason Segal interview kind of came about. I was a huge fan of The Spectacular Now and James Ponsoldt's work on that. A really big fan of Jason Segal, whether it was from How I Met Your Mother, Forgetting Sarah Marshall, Freaks and Geeks. There was tons of stuff I'd kind of watched with him growing up. And again, I usually kind of saw him more as a funny man, definitely more of a goofy, silly kind of comedian type who definitely has some heart that he puts out there in his films and his performances. So I was really curious about that, kind of to see that side of him. And then Jesse Eisenberg, he's such a curious actor, because I know a lot of people maybe are frustrated by him or feel like he kind of only plays the neurotic type as it feels like in a lot of films. He kind of carries some of those tendencies maybe. But yes, there was an opportunity to interview Jason Segal for this. So I chomped at the bit. I was like, all right, well, I've got to watch the movie first. And immediately after that, I, again, like with a lot of A24 films, I don't know what I expected going into this movie, but coming out of it, I think I got so much more than I could have ever predicted. And it came at a time where discussions of ego, discussions of mental health, all of these different things, like back in 2015, maybe it was just starting to change a little bit. I know today we live in a society that is far more open about mental health struggles, about the different things that people are dealing with. But for, almost 10 years ago, it felt kind of fresh as far as what they were talking about narratively and what we're not totally talking about in the world. And so sitting down with Jason Segal I was able to do a kind of a 3-on-1 interview with him, with a couple good friends of mine and critics up here, Matt Oakes and Jason Rostel. We just had, the most unique interview experience I've probably ever had. He spoke to something that at the time we kind of giggled at, but I know was totally true. He said, it's crazy how often people will come up to you on the street and they'll say, hey, can I get a selfie with you? I'm such a big fan. And he's like, oh, well, thank you so much. That's really kind. And he said, I would offer people, because he's like, I don't love selfies or the quick little, oh, yep, here's a little snapshot so people will believe you for whatever that was worth, But he's like, I want to give you an opportunity. He's like, we could take a picture together and then both go on our way. Or you could shake my hand and, we could have a conversation. And he's like, somewhat unsurprisingly, a lot of people opt for the photo because, well, my friends are never going to believe this, they're never going to, they're not going to believe that I met Jason Segal unless I have the proof. And he's like, well, that's a weird thing to believe, He's like, I don't know why you would lie about something like that, And he's like, I was in France at the Louvre and I was stoked to see the Mona Lisa until you get there and a billion people have their phones out taking pictures of it. And it's behind glass. It's so far away. You got selfie sticks. He's just like, there's so much art and beauty in this place that people are missing because they're so concerned with, I need people to see that I'm here. I need people to know that I'm with the Louvre. I need you to know that I have done this and it's documented. And that is my proof. That is the only way that the world will believe me, that I'll get some validation from that. And then the second thing, and I believe is a quote from the book in the movie, but this is something that I spout to people all the time when they're worried about image and what people think. And there's a quote from David Foster Wallace, and it's something along the lines of, you'll start to care less what people really think, or you'll start to care less what people think of you when you realize how seldom they actually do. And for whatever reason, especially after kind of Segal had shared that quote again, something about that, it just stuck with me. And as far as cultivating your own growth as a person and trying not to get so caught up in everything in our world or taking everything so personally or feeling like, oh, I can't go out of the house looking like this, or I can't imagine what so-and-so is going to think about me because I didn't do whatever, as human beings, we're so wired to only think about ourselves. And even, we get these selfish thoughts of, I'm sure so-and-so is eagerly awaiting my arrival tonight, so I can't be late or I can't be wearing this because I know that they're probably expecting da-da-da-da-da-da. And you get there later and they're like, oh, you know what? I wasn't even worried about it. I didn't even think twice about it. And there's so many moments that we just work ourselves up for nothing.
All right. I think a great place to kind of maybe launch off is Jason Segal's performance. And, I mentioned early how, there's talk about whether or not he'd get nominated for an Oscar or not. And unfortunately, it didn't end up happening. But for me, I liked How I Met Your Mother, but I'm not a super fan. I haven't seen every episode. I do find it funny. And I find outside of his comedic work, he's been a little hit or miss for me at times. But I think this film really sort of captured maybe what his best self could be. I haven't seen Shrinking, and I know he's gotten a lot of great reviews for that too. But outside of...
Also done by, I think, James Ponsoldt, right?
Yes, I believe he is involved with it.
I haven't watched it either, but I've heard great things. But
yeah, outside of Forgetting Sarah Marshall, where I think because he co-wrote that, was really able to tap into something special, this was, for me, the best work I've ever seen him do. And the fact that he's able to carry around this quiet confidence of knowing that he's always the smartest person in every room that he goes into, but it's also a bit of a curse because he can't not be the smartest person in every room that he walks into. And you see that a few times. I think of, there's the scene where he does the NPR interview and you think, NPR is so highbrow, and he goes in there and you can sort of see he's clenching up and cringing already on the inside. He's just dying. He does not want to be there because he knows that he is intellectually superior to both this reporter and everyone listening. It just is eating him up inside. Yet at the same time, all he wants to do is watch, dumb action movies with his friends and eat junk food and things like that. So I think he's able to really handle the duality of this person who knows that if he wants to, he could be the most confident, charming person, but also someone who is suffering from depression. And that the very thing that makes him so great is also eating him alive.
Mm-hmm. It's a pretty tough duality there, because you're right. There was a quote, I think, that Lipsky kind of says at one point when he's talking to him about social strategy and just this idea of changing yourself maybe for different people that you're around, or kind of dumbing your intelligence down based on who you're around. And this idea that, you're doing this just because you're patronizing me, or you're patronizing the guy on NPR or whatever. But it's like, really, like, no, I think part of it comes from, you want to hold back sometimes too. I think you're able to read the room sometimes. And that's something I think Segal as Foster Wallace really does well, is it's like, okay, yeah, I've done my scan. I've listened in. The people here just aren't on the level intellectually to have the kind of conversations that I'm having, to understand the depth of humanity, kind of like I'm having. And, there's this idea that, you're putting on this facade, patronizing me here in the car because a guy, you don't open 1,000-page book because, the guy's not brilliant. And it is just such a weird side of, I think, like an actor taking on a lead role in a film. There's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. People are going to be looking to you both on set and off set to kind of carry this film. And so there's a little bit of ego and weight that comes with that as well. It's the side of like, okay, well, clearly I'm talented enough to be here charged with this role. But inside, it's like, do I really have what it takes to do this? Am I able to rise to this occasion without feeling inauthentic, without, making it about me also, and making it some, the Jason Segal show. And so I think he really does do a brilliant job just showcasing some of that struggle, trying to connect, whether it's intellectually with Lipsky, or then it's like, hey, we can drop the intelligence talk and let's talk about, the TV that I'm watching, or let's talk about some of these other mild interests that are probably not good for your readership, probably uninteresting for them, but two guys just really trying to connect. And, it kind of pissed me off throughout the movie, just listening to Lipsky's character. And it's a credit to Eisenberg, because he's so good with these little comments, these kind of snide remarks, or these biting questions where it's like, dude, did you need to ask that? Did you really need to slip that in there? It's like, I thought we're having like a genuine moment. And then you're like, oh, you're going to work in a quick, like, so when you were under suicide watch, and
yeah,
just, casually dropping these little things where it's like, number one, read the room here. We're having a conversation. And to just throw in this like, hey, my Rolling Stone needs me to hit these hot button topics. It's just heartbreaking kind of to watch him realize that maybe Lipsky's really not there as a fan totally either. It's obviously not the experience that he wants, because he's not the writer he thought he was to be. The movie's really fascinating in how you look at some of those intellectual power dynamics. It's heartbreaking to watch.
Yeah, it is. I think that Eisenberg's Lipsky is a very good intellectual match for Wallace, and he's the first person that probably sees Wallace for who he really is. And yet, you think any Rolling Stone writer or any magazine writer or whoever is profiling Wallace would be so excited to learn that the world's most foremost genius at this very moment is also just a regular guy who, likes who likes eating so much junk food, and TV is his current addiction, and his favorite breakfast is cigarettes and things like that. Like that would sort of be a dream profile where I'd be like, oh, the world's smartest man is actually just an everyday regular guy. And Lipsky sees absolutely right through that and understands the duality of, yes, you can be that and want to present yourself that way, but at the same time understanding that, like you said, and that's my favorite line in the whole movie, is people don't crack open a 1,000-page book because they hear that the guy is a regular guy. They do it because they believe that he's a genius and he has something to say. And that's the part that really sort of shuts Wallace up, where he knows that's absolutely true. He knows from the history of any book that he's ever read, from anything he's ever picked up, he knows that when he picks it up, that the person who wrote this is the foremost expert on that subject, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, whatever it is, they know what the hell they're talking about. And so I think Eisenberg does a really good job of sort of bringing out that intellectual debate that the two of them have. And yeah, he really knows how to push his buttons, because I think he sees a lot of himself in Wallace. The difference being Wallace, got famous, but he sees himself in that the few times Lipsky is pushed about, what his relationship status is and things like that, what's happening with his girlfriend and long distance relationship, that triggers him too. And so he knows he knows how to push Wallace's buttons, and Wallace knows how to push Lipsky's buttons, because they're more or less quite similar in that they're both academically incredibly high functioning, socially a little awkward, want to present themselves as an everyday person, and they've all got these like similar layers, and they're kind of going back and forth. The only difference is one of them is the world's most famous author at that moment, and the other one is having to take a job at a magazine because his book can't sell any copies.
Mm-hmm. And then and the irony is they're probably the two smartest guys in every room that they go into for the most part. Mm-hmm. But there is that idea of celebrity, and I don't know what it is, that it just instantly feels like, okay, just because people have said that you're better, I'm believing it, and I have to believe it, because you have to be better than me to be more successful than me. I can't accept that you're a regular guy, because what does that say about me then? Mm-hmm. I'm losing out to a regular guy. A regular guy can put out a book that becomes the greatest seller of the year, and people love him, whatever. And it's like, I'm a regular guy. I wrote a book, and you could see Lipsky's character just kind of comparing himself, or talking about where they're at with age too, and different things. And I love, when they bring the two girls back to the house after, and Lipsky's kind of chatting one of them up, knowing full well that she had dated David back in the day. And you see him obviously knowing well that, okay, yeah, he's also got a girl over here. He's got a girl here. And now he's in Minnesota, snagging the email from this girl under the guise of, in case I want to read your poems, and I want to, if I've got some questions, maybe your email will help, and Foster Wallace just calls him on it. And I just love the line he hits him at the end. It's just like, just be a good guy. Just be a good guy. What about your girl over in California? He's like, she means something to me. I specifically asked you not to involve her. I don't want you to involve her. Just be a good guy.
I wonder about the Lipsky character, and I find him very fascinating because we see that I don't want to call him a failed author, but he's had a couple books published, a couple things published, and they really don't go anywhere, and that's why he takes this job at Rolling Stone. But then after he does this profile of David Foster Wallace, it ends up winning awards about some of the best interviews of the year. I can't remember exactly what awards he was winning, but they were literary awards. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, after Foster Wallace dies, we see in the movie that Lipsky actually writes a book about his time with Wallace. And so he's basically writing a story about Wallace, and then later writes a story about writing a story about Wallace. And I don't want to demean him at all, but it sort of seems interesting to me how his most prominent works as a writer have been writing about another writer, which I don't know how he feels about that. We don't really get a sense from Eisenberg that it's, detrimental to his mental health or anything like that. I think while he's writing the original piece, it's sort of chewing him up a bit. But, I think he realizes that this was a person, not necessarily a friend, but a peer in the sense of we are both intellectual writers, difference being one got famous and one didn't. So I was wondering if you have any sort of thoughts on this idea of, writing a book about writing about a writer.
That, in my head, I'm trying to think of what it immediately reminds me of, this idea that someone's success is kind of predicated on the fact that they're only covering a more successful person, and the draw to read this comes to read or watch this, comes from, oh, well, I'm curious about David Foster Wallace, so that's why I'm buying this interview book, And again, I feel like that kind of trickles into that side of ego. And I am sure to a degree, I can only imagine maybe in real life that he may feel some type of way about that. But I also would hope that having spent that week with David Foster Wallace, sitting on those tapes for as long as he did, I hopefully he has approached it or has made peace with it in the sense that, hey, this is it. I think he says it at the end of the movie. It's like, this was the greatest week of conversation of my life. And I think if anything, if I were in his position, I'd look back and probably, if I'm listening to those tapes and listening to the interactions, I'm sure there's the guilt or the feeling of like, I wish I could go back maybe and just listen to actually what he was saying and really enjoying my time there with him rather than trying to dig at some bigger story or to find a little bit of dirt that I can get. And so I hope, if anything, it comes more as an acknowledgement or understanding of like, hey, I am linked to this guy forever, for better or for worse, and the reality is that he probably was smarter, but hopefully you are humble enough to take the wisdom that was imparted, to understand your role in some of these things, and to, I think, put your best foot forward from that front in terms of just owning up to like, hey, this is, maybe it wasn't how I would have liked things to have gone, but in retrospect and everything we learned, here's kind of how it changed me as a man, as a human being, as a writer, kind of changing around maybe what is important to me in my world, whether it's literary success or it's just, I am putting my most authentic self out there now, maybe for the first time,
Yeah. I want to talk about the scene towards the end of the film where it's the morning before Lipsky is about to go back home, and Wallace and Lipsky kind of have their biggest fight. And we get this great emotional scene where Wallace really sort of bears his soul truthfully for the first time to Lipsky, where there's sort of no filter attached to this. And I think from a filmmaking perspective, it was so fascinating because we get this shot. It's mostly in the dark because it's at night, I believe. And
when he kind of comes into his bedroom.
Yeah, and Lipsky is laying down in his bed trying to fall asleep, but he can't. And so we get the shot of Eisenberg basically awkwardly holding the cover over himself as tears are running down his face as Segal is sort of bearing his soul as Wallace. And just such a fascinating shot to set up, and it's not something we really ever see. And it sort of shows, I guess, if we're talking about the way it was set up structurally, you get the power dynamics of Wallace being taller and over top of him and Lipsky on the ground below him and sort of what that means and all that sort of stuff. But I just found it was such an interesting composition because we never really see shots like that in film.
Sure. No, you're right. Or if you do, it feels like it's I don't know why Wedding Crashers comes to mind, just as the first film where someone's like sitting on the edge of the bed or something with you. Like, I feel like if it is a shot like that, it's always usually a different scenario. But you're right. It is such a disarming moment, I think, for the audience and for Lipsky's character. Because you're right. It is, you've spent this whole weekend telling me I'm not being authentic, telling me that I'm just feeding you stuff that you want to hear. You want from the soul, let me bear it to you now. This idea of the spiritual crisis, feeling like, I reached a point where, I think he says, he's like, it's like by the time I turned 28, I didn't really know what was left for me in the world. I didn't feel like there was anything for me anymore, and that I've done all that I could do or have done. And it just, for the same thing that you were kind of speaking to earlier, I think Eisenberg, as Lipsky, sees so much of himself in David Foster Wallace, and so much of that is a sadness and a feeling of, I haven't accomplished maybe what I want to, or I have done X, Y, and Z. I've been lauded for all these awards and whatever, but I'm still not happy. I'm still not, this, Lipsky maybe views it as like, well, hey, if people are finally going to read my book, if I just had the kind of success that he had, if I had the people reading me like he did, I'd be so well off. I'd be great. My problems would be solved. I'd be happier. I'm sure my relationship with my girlfriend or whatever is probably going to be better. All these assumptions that if I could just have this little bit of success, then I'll be great. And that was actually something that Segal kind of touched on just in our interview too, with this idea that, you spend your 20s trying to figure out the world. But also, it can be demoralizing sometimes. It can feel like, someone else is so much further ahead of me at the same exact age. I'm never going to catch up. I'm never going to reach my potential. I don't know what I can contribute to this world that's worthwhile because I feel like I'm already behind. And those are such human thoughts that I think it is hard to escape from having, whether or not they're real. The intrusive voices are always trying to get us. But I think in that moment, those silent tears come because it's just like, hey, I have never heard someone put into words so well exactly what I'm feeling,
Are there any other aspects of the film that you want to bring up that we haven't touched on yet?
It's more of just a last thought, because, amid all this heavy conversation, they do have brief moments, like you said, where it's like, all right, we're just going to be guys. We're going to talk about the television I'm obsessed with. We're going to talk about these things. And they have a talk where it's sort of deep-ish, but they're talking about technology. And not to be crude for the listeners, but at one point they're discussing this idea of like, pornography, man, things are going to get so much worse when the internet gets better, when virtual reality becomes a thing. He's like, companies, corporations, these people don't care about us. They care about a profit line, but what they're doing is they're creating technology that just continues to isolate the human experience. And he's like, we're heading down a path where in the future, the technology is only going to get better and better at making sure that you've got everything you need just on your own, completely taking you out of any real interaction with people. And, it's brought up kind of as a joke in the sense of like, all right, well, you think it's bad now, but you'll be watching virtual reality porn and you're going to feel empty. He's like, you're going to feel completely empty.
On sort of a comment about you were talking about the technology aspect, something that actually sort of stood out to me, because this was a movie that was made in 2015 and the movie takes place in 1996. And I have to wonder if it was an actual quote by Wallace or maybe something inserted by Ponsoldt, where he's talking about, the way the internet is changing in virtual reality and virtual reality porn and things like that. And I have a hard time believing that was a topic of conversation in 1996, considering how much of an infancy the internet was. And you couldn't even watch videos on the internet, let alone, this idea of
that dial-up. I'm thinking of that Luke Wilson movie, and I can't remember the name of it, but doing all their dial-up pornography or whatever, trying to strike gold in the early days of the internet.
So I don't know how, like, if that was an actual thing he was said, or maybe something that Ponsoldt inserted that sounded like something he would have said.
Are we trying to make it a little more everyman too for the modern audience, to give them something to maybe identify with as far as what Foster Wallace is talking about, maybe?
Because it seems a whole lot less prescient, writing it in 2015, looking at what the future's going to be like, as opposed to someone actually saying it in 1996. So that was the only thing that sort of jumped a bit as not necessarily a red flag, but sort of caught my attention a little bit of like,
sure.
Right,
you listen to it and you're like, I want to hope that that's in the book, but I could totally see this being an inserted for dramatic effect or for narrative purposes.
Yeah. All right, so let us go to our game portion. So, as always, if you are a regular listener, you know this, but we're going to do two things here. We're going to make a double bill pairing. The only criteria is that it cannot be another A24 film. And then afterwards, we will have a Would You Rather question. So, Nick, as my guest, what double bill pairing would you make with the end of the tour?
Could I give you two? If I gave you a quick, there's a comedy and then there's a drama that I would double bill this with. I would say that the drama feels a little more in line with the topics discussed in the film. I love the movie Birdman by Alejandro Inarritu. Great movie that really dives deep into so many aspects of celebrity, of ego, self-doubt, depression, feeling like you've been kind of chained to one thing. In Birdman's case, it's this superhero role that he can never shake. People never take him seriously as someone who can deliver something dramatic, something profound. The way that people speak to him and talk about him and what they want from him is not what he wants for himself. If you wanted a lighter affair after watching the end of the tour, I would double bill it with Chef from Jon Favreau. And, it's another weird one, but that's another movie that in a different way, you look at this chef who is so confident in the food that he creates. This is his life's passion. He's a little more defensive, I'd say, than David Foster Wallace is as far as an artist goes, But in Chef, you deal with these journalists who pick apart your food or your restaurant. And, so much of what he does is based on what people might say about his food, or I'm only doing these things to please this one critic or this one guy. And so much of my internal struggle and things that I am feeling with and these frustrations are because I'm trying to live my life to please some food critic.
Yeah, those are some good picks. For me, my choice would be Almost Famous. The reason why I think it's pretty obvious. It's about a Rolling Stone writer who is covering a band while they are on tour, and we even get quotes like, "Remember, they're not actually your friends. You are there to interview them and get a story." There's just a lot of parallels in similar structure as far as going between the end of the tour and Almost Famous. The difference being one is the music world and one is the literary world.
Absolutely. I like that's a great pick. I am due for a rewatch of that movie. Some of because it was early 2000s for Almost Famous.
Yeah, that
I want to
came out in 2000.
Okay. All right. There it's funny, on my website, or just I've always had like my list of trying to go back as far as I can, give you a top 10 of all the films I've seen at least in a year. There's some years where I'm like, I've only seen 10 films in 2003, I guess, but Almost Famous, I remember really enjoying it on first watch, but now that you have mentioned this and just having rewatched the end of the tour, I'm going to give that a go. Because that is a fantastic movie. And your quote there, the quote that you shared from the movie there, kind of might segue into my Would You Rather, actually, quite nicely.
Well, excellent. Well, then hit me with your Would You Rather then.
Let me get this wording right here. Would you rather, in the spirit of the film, spend a week interviewing who you consider, whoever this is, your favorite filmmaker? You get to spend a week with them. You get to interview it, but the catch is you don't get to post it. For all the great content you get, you never get to post it. But you can kind of continue a relationship afterwards with this person. Or would you rather have access to all the greatest celebrities, the greatest directors, writers, actors, and you get your little 5-minute interviews with them, but that's it. You get to do those for the rest of your days, but it's 5 minutes, and Rolling Stone's going to pick your questions for you.
Ooh, that is tough, because in scenario one, if you don't have the work published to show for it, it's hard to continue to get work after that. You can't use that as a resume. Mm-hmm. Whereas in option B, you do have that, but you're not really getting the work that you would want or not necessarily desire, and it probably isn't going to be all that great, but you get to have a career out of it. Mm-hmm. When I do interviews, I do pride myself on trying to come up with the best, most unique and original question. So that's something that's really difficult. But that said, if you don't have any other work to show, you can't get any future work. And so I'm going to have to go with option B, unfortunately.
That's all right. That's all right. It was a tough question that I was thinking of, just thinking about it. So have you ever seen the movie The Final Girls?
No, I haven't.
It's a film from Todd Strauss. Oh, I blank on his last name. He's got the hyphenated. But he'd done one of the Harold and Kumars, and he brought The Final Girls to South by Southwest the first year I went. Watched the movie, had a great time with it, got in touch with the publicist, wasn't totally able to schedule an interview, but what ended up happening was, hey, if you have time, we can have some dinner, talk over dinner before I have to go do something else. And I was like, okay, yeah, wow, I'm going to skip the movie that I was going to go see that evening. I'm going to go meet him there. Had the phone out recording. We must have been there for almost 2 hours. And at some point, Vanessa Bayer from SNL comes in because she had a movie there, and she kind of comes over and talks to him. And eventually he's kind of like, all right, I kind of have to wrap up because I'm going over there now or whatever, we've got to go out for the evening. But here I am with 2+ hours almost of audio and what is more just a casual conversation. In my head, I'm like, there's no, I'm trying to transcribe some of this later on. And, 10 years ago, there weren't as great of transcribing options to help you out perhaps as well. And so it just became this I'm like, I don't have the time to transcribe all of this. And obviously this would be a really, really long audio review. Here I am, years later now, if I'm dropping a 2-hour podcast, maybe someone will listen to it. 10 years ago, I thought there's no way in hell anyone's going to listen to this, All
right. So moving on to my question. As a published author, would being stuck having to work at a magazine you don't like and not being able to choose your subject matter to cover, or would you rather work at a community college where you were teaching young people to write who often submit some really terrible work where most of your time is spent grading papers? So this is sort of the stuck in purgatory question.
Oh, okay. Interesting. And maybe it's just because I've got it's not a weird vendetta against Rolling Stone. I think Rolling Stone makes a lot of grading lists, whether it's from, the top 100 comic book movies, or here's our top 50 dramas, or, they make a lot of listicles that I just kind of roll my eyes at. I think if you would have asked me this right after the movie had come out, maybe I would have done the Rolling Stone job, but I think perhaps teaching at the community college might be just a little bit more worthwhile for me as far as what I might get out of it, as far as a little bit more control you have over your situation. Granted, reading a lot of those essays might not be the most enjoyable, and I know as a son of an educator how long you can spend grading homework and things, but I think I would go for the community college route, though. I think that of the two, I think I could get a little bit more out of that life or those interactions, or maybe that's that side of, maybe I'm the failed author, but you can hope to inspire some of the future authors, maybe, or you can kind of give some guidance, or hey, avoid these pitfalls that I got stuck in.
Yeah, I think I agree with you too. I sort of like it when I get the chance to sort of nurture people and be like, hey, you're doing a great job. You should keep doing what you're doing. And you sort of see the spark continue in them. And like, yeah, most of the time it's probably going to be crap that you're reading and really derivative stuff. And especially, if it's nowadays, you're hearing all these, stories about teachers having to be like, all right, who's using ChatGPT to write their papers?
Let me run it through the AI.
Yeah. So I think you're going to have to deal with a lot of that, but I think that's no different than, back in the day, people would, copy and paste wholesale stuff that they find in some obscure book, just change the wording around a little bit. The difference is now you've got computers that will do that for you. It's still plagiarism or cheating regardless. But yeah, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head of, every once in a while, you're probably going to get something that's actually pretty good. And the fact that if you can nurture someone and help them along the way and inspire them, maybe you're not going to be the next great author, but maybe you help bring along the next great author. All right. Well, I think that is a perfect place to wrap up where we are today. Nick, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find you, and do you have anything that you want to promote right now?
Well, thank you again so much for having me. This is really awesome just to be able to chat with you and to join the Contra Zoom pod and just kind of get embedded with a lot of new voices who I've really enjoyed kind of getting to read and listen to. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you for letting me talk your ear off. You can find me, my film website for written reviews and interviews is nicktiffany.com. I've also got Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube, all under NT Movie Reviews. I do some more in-depth breakdowns of movies I'm watching. I'll do a written review to a degree, but we'll usually drop a longer podcast version just to speak a little more in depth about it. And so you can find us on all the social media network platforms, doing a little bit of TikTok and Reels, trying to keep up with some of what the young kids are doing these days. But just finding a way to really get back into the whole world of film criticism. I was out for a little while, but Aaron White, to his credit, brought me back to another screening, and it's crazy how, one screening after not going to them for 5 years, maybe, it just all came back. It was like, okay, yeah, I can't not talk about movies anymore. It was killing me for years, and there's so many. I'm so glad so many movies are re-releasing again, just to have the opportunity to talk about just so many of the great things. I feel like I'm like, I saw this years ago, but I never wrote a review, and how are people going to know that it's good? So it's been really enjoyable to get back into this world and to be surrounded by such awesome film critics. And so thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be on here.
Of course. I will make sure to link to where people can go to your website to find your work and of course, your socials. And yeah, just once again, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you, man.
This has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at ContraZoomPod. What are your thoughts on the end of the tour? Send an email to ContraZoomPod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.